Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, which is a set of words that anyone can say, but only I can say sincerely. Now, have you ever wondered what you might have done as a fan of musical theatre 100 years ago, which was before even when I was born? What did people do a century ago to find out about the shows that they loved, particularly musical theatre shows? Well, there has always been appreciation of theatre in Britain, and indeed elsewhere, and there's always been particular appreciation of musical theatre in all its forms in Britain. And that was as true 100 years ago as it is today. And where there is an interest, there's always somebody out there trying to fill that gap in the market. And that's exactly what happened. So before Musical Talk, if you can imagine such a bare, unhappy world, there was something called, at least in the first 40 years of the 20th century, the play Pictorial. And that was a magazine that ran from 1902 all the way up to 1939. And so really covers, as I say, the first 4 decades of the 20th century. And those 4 decades are marvellous in terms of musical theatre history, because it's in that period that we see the triumph, if you like, of musical comedy over its sister form, operetta. And of course, during that period, you also get some of the greats, people like Gershwin and Kern, Cole Porter, Rodgers and Hart. Those are the Americans. And there are also British people like Ivor Novello and Noel Coward who are writing plays, but also musical theatre, and it has to be said, still operetta as well. So it's a ripe and gorgeous time. And the great thing about the play Pictorial is that although it was aimed at theatre in general, and particularly what was going on in the West End in London, it didn't really make a distinction between speech marks straight plays and musical theatre. And why should it? Because I think this idea of musical theatre as being something different to theatre, or at least to drama, is a false one, and yet it's something that so many of us refer to all the time in shorthand. Musical theatre is no more than theatre with music. The clues really are all there in the term. So how did the play Pictorial come about? Well, the Edwardian era, that period of the first 10 or so years, I think in real terms actually up to 1914, the beginning of the First World War, saw, at least in Britain, a sense of leisure, of time being available to many people, all the way from the aristocracy, actually down quite a long way into the working class, through the middle class, and also a sense of affluence. There was more money than there had been before. There was also mostly peace. And so people had a bit more time, a bit more money, and one of the things they did, because this is before radio, and it's before television, and it's really in the very, very early days of cinema, people went to the theatre. They always had done, and they always will, of course, but this was a great time. It was the beginning of one of the golden ages of British theatre. And a number of people saw that this was happening in society and decided to tap in to the market that came with people who were going to the theatre and were therefore interested in drama, and also the performers who were appearing in drama, the actors and actresses. It's not a million miles away from the world of celebrity that we live in today. And a number of these magazines were all created at the same time. There was the play Pictorial, there was Stage World, there was plenty more in that style. But the one that sort of became preeminent, at least for the first 40 years of that century, from 1902 onwards, was the play Pictorial. And because what it was, cleverly, was a picture record of some of the shows. So if you had been to the theatre and enjoyed a show, you might buy a programme there, but then you could go home and buy the Play Pictorial magazine and see pictures. And indeed, in the first 10 or so years, there were also extracts of the musical scores, so that you could play them at home on your piano, or harmonium, perhaps. There were short articles about the piece. There were sometimes make-up tips, costume articles. As I say, lots of photographs, extracts from the lyrics. It was like an in-depth programme, or almost like an episode of Musical Talk in some senses. It didn't quite review, but it certainly told you about the creation of the piece. And indeed, the man who would go on to become the principal editor of the magazine for most of its run, a man called B.W. Findon, often used to start with a letter from various composers or playwrights as the editorial article in the magazines. So you would start, quite often, a particular magazine featuring one particular show, with a full-page introductory article by one of the creatives. Not quite an interview, but certainly an insight into the creative process. And as I say, the magazine prospered really right up until the Second World War. It ran from 1902 until 1939, and it started absorbing some of those other magazines which didn't last so long. So, for example, in 1905, it merged with a magazine called The Play. Makes perfect sense. The Play and the Play Pictorial, they're not doing different things, as you can tell. And although it started in 1902, it was really in 1904 when, as I say, B.W. Findon took over that it sort of hit its mark. It did change over the years, but for the most part, certainly for the first 3 decades, each edition would feature, for the most part, one show. And once every 3 or 4 editions, the show featured would be a musical show. And therefore, by following the publication of the Play Pictorial over its 40 years, you can see how British musical theatre developed. There were many operetta in the first 10 years, but also some of the newly created American-style, and in some cases American-originated musical theatre shows or musical comedy shows. But you can see the operetta dying out. You can see the implications of the First World War. You can see the taste for frivolity that came in from the 1920s. You can see the further influence of Americans in the late 20s. And then from the 1930s, the magazine changes again. Each magazine starts to feature more than one show and has regular cartoon features. Becomes a bit more article-based, rather than becoming, if you like, a programme writ large. But of course, all good things must come to an end. And with edition 446, the magazine itself was taken over by somebody else, a magazine called Theatre World, and survived through the war into the 40s and 50s, but not called the Play Pictorial. Now, I find old editions of the Play Pictorial absolutely fascinating. They really do give you an insight into shows which are just lost. You can find things online occasionally, but seeing a magazine dedicated to a particular musical of that period, with photographs of the stars, with photographs of the sets and the costumes, and articles about the makeup, and indeed sometimes about the creation of the piece, really gives you an insight into what people were looking at 100 years ago, 80 years ago, however long ago it was that the edition you're holding was printed. And so I thought it would be a wheeze to invite Tim Saywood, an old friend of this programme, to sit down with me and just go through a few random copies of the Play Pictorial from that period of its publication between 1902 and 1939. And Tim hadn't seen any of these before, so he was coming at these fresh. And I think his insights and those things which caught his eye are very interesting contextually, historically, in terms of musical theatre. So today's episode is really, I hope, just a bit of fun about what you, a Musical Talk listener, might have been doing, say, 100 years ago, instead of listening to a podcast. I hope you enjoy this slightly sideways look at the world of musical theatre. Musical Talk. Ladies and gentlemen, musical talk, of course, can only have been a relatively modern phenomenon in the sense that it's a podcast and therefore relied on podcasting and the internet. So what did the hungry musical talk style listener of the 1920s and 30s do before musical talk came about? Well, the answer is play magazines, believe it or not. A very great plethora of publications came out for the first 50, 60, 70 years of the 20th century, which were all about theatre and some about musicals. One of the best known, or I say best known, but the one that did the trick best, was the Play Pictorial, which used to dedicate issues to 1 or 2 shows. Quite often they were musical shows, and there would be, as you'd expect with a title like Play Pictorial, pictures of the scenes going on in the play, the actors, perhaps interviews with set designers, and sometimes extracts from the lyrics. So I'm pleased to say I'm being joined today by Tim Saywood.
Hello.
And we have got a random collection of Play Pictorial and other musical theatre magazines from the first half of the 20th century from my personal collection. And we're just going to go through them and see what tickle our proverbial fancies. Tim, do you want to just go through the magazines I've put before you and tell you what the names of the shows are?
Sorry, my fancies proverbially are being tickled and I was a bit distracted for a moment. But certainly, I will tell you what. I'm looking at the front cover of the Play Pictorial, number 324, from volume 54 to be exact. And I'm just trying to find exactly when this one comes from. This one's dated... It's not dated, actually. And I'm just trying to work out what the date is on this one, but actually it's not specifically dated. However, the picture story on the front cover, which is turned 90 degrees around to accommodate the actual...
It's a portrait-style magazine with a landscape picture, isn't it?
Yes, basically. The picture features Fred Astaire, Adele Astaire, and Leslie Henson, and they're appearing in Funny Face, which...
It's a George Gershwin musical.
Dating from the 1920, we're not quite sure.
Yeah.
But I assume this is the film version that we're...
No. It is the musical version. The film version came out in the 50s, actually. It's much later.
So am I right? Because this is clearly a London magazine. It says that it's actually based at 9 Adam Street, Strand.
It says 6 Adam Street, Strand.
It says 9 here.
Oh, look, this one says 6.
Oh, they moved. Okay, well, that's fine. For the back issues.
The edition...
Maybe they had so many back issues by the time of No Nanette, or in fact the other way around, because that's an earlier edition, that they had to move. They had to take up 2 more houses on the street. Anyway, look, it was published by the Stage Pictorial Publishing Company Limited, and... are we talking about London productions only here?
Yes.
And so actually Fred Astaire was appearing over in London at this time?
Yes, he and his sister were
as Jimmy Reeve, it says here.
Yeah, were very, very popular, became close personal friends of the Prince of Wales, who went on to become Edward VIII briefly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, very much part of fashionable society.
Prince David, okay, so... We've got B.W. Findon as the editor. Oh, and here we are. I have found the date at last. It's March the 1st, 1929, this editorial was written to.
And I think Findon was the original editor who... he's most famous, by the way, for writing a biography of Arthur Sullivan. And they were friends. And Sullivan died in 1900. So by 1929, B.W. Findon was getting on a bit.
Right, okay. Well, he was certainly looking backwards in terms of the people he was talking about in the editorial. Mentoring Sir Arthur Wing Pinero, for example, and Sutro, Alfred Sutro, and he also mentions Beaumont and Fletcher, but that's going back a very long way indeed. And so clearly those were about the sort of plays of the time. So just having a look, clearly they've made a big fuss about Funny Face, and in fact there's a half-a-page advert here. Funny Face, lyrics by Ira Gershwin, music by George Gershwin. And in fact, what this is Chappell & Co., the music publishers, of 50 New Bond Street, London. A couple of years later, they were at 52 New Bond Street, of course, as you know, charging 2 shillings net each. I assume that was before tax, of the sheet music for all of the various numbers. And not only
which include
My One and Only, Swonderful, He Loves and She Loves, Funny Face, and Let's Kiss and Make Up. However, interestingly, we've also got the theatrical costumiers, Morris Angel and Son, advertising directly underneath. They have a telegraphic address of Theatre IO London.
Now, Morris Angel and Son are angels.
Oh, I see, as in...
They still exist.
Oh, okay. Oh, Angels Costumes.
Yeah.
I see. I thought you meant that they were investors in the place.
No, Morris Angels.
They are the civil, naval and military tailors and theatrical costumiers, and in fact they provided the gentleman's character and modern dresses worn in Funny Face, made and supplied by our firm, among other productions. So clearly Funny Face was the hit of the day, and not only that, but Columbia Records, on the opposite page, have an advert for a recording. You can only hear the theatre artists on Columbia Records, with Fred and Adele Astaire, Leslie Henson, etc. And for a 12-inch dark blue label, they were 4 and 6 each, I should have you know. But if you went for the 10-inch dark blue label, they were only 3 shillings a piece. So there we are. And look, you even had some piano solos by the composer, which I don't know what format that was in, possibly piano roll at this stage, I don't know.
Yes, because there are some rare recordings of Gershwin's piano rolls. And
that's right, well, yes, indeed. Yeah. So in fact, he was a very prolific piano roll user. Anyway, moving on. And not only did they use the actual title of the current hit of the day, but Miss Adele Astaire, its star, was busy advertising for an entire page Pond's
cold cream.
Pond's cold cream.
Yeah, ladies' makeup.
Endorsement. And basically, pretty much every other page is devoted to this. So it was clearly the wicked of its day, wasn't it?
Yes. Oh, it's interesting when you actually compare it to now. You expect to see people advertising and tie-ins, but it's amazing that here we are in 1929 with exactly that self-same thing. Records, sheet music, makeup.
Capitalism hasn't changed any bit.
Well, 1929 was a bad year for capitalism.
We hadn't actually reached that bad point at this point. Okay, so there's a big piece of editorial about it and a series of pictorial ones, including quoting bits of the...
Would you care to pick a bit of dialogue we might act?
I did actually just see, yes. Let's see if we can find... Bear with me while I search through.
But these are full-page plate photographs, aren't they?
Yes, that's right, yes. Very beautiful, actually. Fred Astaire, here we are. Yes, we've got, for example, where Herbert says St George for England and Dugsy says
St Pancras for Scotland. They are drunk in the picture, which is should explain they are probably the comedy double act.
We've also got, for reasons I assume best known to the producers, bathing beauties at Lake Wapatog. I guess that's in the play.
But what are they wearing?
Not an awful lot, I suppose, although by today's standards it's rather a lot.
Well, they're one-piece swimming costumes,
Yeah, they're
aren't they?
one-piece swimming costumes in a sort of sailor style.
Lots of legs and arms on show, but they're all wearing cloche hats.
These are all flappers, basically, and except without so much of the flap, I suppose. But anyway.
There's one very risque one at the end, if I may say. You can see her bra strap.
That's true, you can, yes. She's got an off-the-shoulder number, as they called it in those days. We also have a full-page plate of Renee Gadd and Fred Astaire and the chorus. My One and Only, which of course is one of the numbers, I think.
It is indeed,
the
yes.
Song,
there's an original recording of, probably on Columbia, actually, let's face it, in my collection, and a lot of people, it's easy to get, which is Fred Astaire singing it with George Gershwin on the piano, and halfway through you can hear George Gershwin say something like, "You go for it, Freddie."
There's also a character called Dugsy. He also has a doctor's quartet, so there's 5 of them on the stage. They're sort of playing ear trumpets, which is very bizarre. Anyway, this is clearly a wacky sort of a musical.
Yes, Dugsy is clearly the comic character. He wears lots of different disguises because he was in a fake moustache in that last picture and not in the drunken one beforehand.
And this is played by Leslie Henson, this
Indeed.
Character.
But that's very much the model of comedies at the time. You had either a romantic couple or a couple. I mean, obviously Fred and Adele were brother and sister, so they were never going to play the romantic couple. But they both find in these Gershwin musicals other lovers. The comedy character, you'd have the secondary comic character, you'd have the bathing, the beautiful chorus.
Yes.
It's all very standard.
Very standard indeed, and very much hyped. We've got to page 60 before we're even into covering the rest of the
What's
the
on in London
theatre scene. And here are some of the things that were on in 1929 at this time. Particularly His Majesty's Theatre, which I don't know which one that is nowadays, His Majesty's, as opposed to Her Majesty's.
It's the same one, they changed the name.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see, because they changed the monarch. Yes,
well,
okay.
no, they don't. It happens anyway.
So where Phantom is currently playing, instead they had, I think, a play version of Beau Geste, adapted by P.C. Wren.
Not a policeman, we should say.
I was going to say, they're doing this on the Metropolitan Constabulary's time. They obviously had a lot of branches in those days. The Lyric Theatre, which is still called the Lyric Theatre. There was Always Afternoon, which sounds like a classic drawing room comedy to me. The Fortune Theatre, which of course is where Blood Brothers has been... No, the Phoenix, that is. And
yes.
The Fortune Theatre was...
I don't know which one that is.
The Woman in Black is currently the Fortune Theatre. Which is just around the corner from Drury Lane, and that's called Craig's Wife by George Kelly. And at the Adelphi, which has seen many a production in my time, they had Mr. Cinders, which famously was a musical by Vivian Ellis, that's right.
Quite well done.
By Rogers and Vivian Ellis, that's right. And,
but it's the famous Mr. Cinders musical, which...
I was going to get mixed up with Cinderfella, I think. And, anyway, do go on.
Spread a Little Happiness and all that kind of stuff.
That's right.
It's some people say it's Vivian Ellis's biggest. It's certainly one of the biggest British musicals of the pre-Second World War period.
Just from looking at some of the cast lists, you can get a flavour of the type of theatrical culture there was at the time. You've got characters in Beau Geste called Major Beaujolais and Lady Patricia. In The Always Afternoon, you've got a maid. Some people called Higgins, the punker boy. You've got in Craig's Wife, you've got Maisie, Mrs. Craig, Ethel Landreth. We're talking about a very sort of insular sort of culture about dealing with largely middle class. Sir George Lancaster features in Mr. Cinders, along with a character called Phyllis Patterson. We're definitely sort of in the upper crust, really. That's who got to appear on the stages, unless they were playing a maid.
As indeed, did you notice who the lead actor in Beau Geste was?
I didn't, actually. It was, Laurence Olivier, yes, okay.
Later, Lord Olivier.
Yes, and not only that, but Jack Hawkins, quite a lot of well-known names there. I'm going to just look ahead. The Haymarket Theatre, which had a play called Quality Street by J.M. Barrie, the Peter Pan creator, featuring such characters as Miss Fanny Willoughby and Miss Henrietta Turnbull. A real person, I think, actually. Anyway, that's them. The Criterion had Her Shop by Amy and Philip Stewart.
These are not...
Featuring characters such as Lady Mary Torrant and Mr. James Arbuthnot.
But these are not musicals, apart from Mr.
No,
Cinders.
These are all plays, exactly. So let's go ahead. Interestingly, at the St. James's Theatre, which I don't think exists any further, there is a new St. James's Theatre now, there was a show called Fame. And right here's where you start paying, presumably, which they were saying after the Wall Street crash.
In perspiration. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, that had characters such as Major Bagshot and Footman.
It doesn't sound like the fame that we know from
No.
1980.
Mrs. Mowat wrote a thing called Fashionable Life in New York, and so on, basically. So, a great assortment of things. And there was also The Serious Side of War, or Journey's End, which, of course, was an R.C. Sheriff play.
And it was new then, wasn't it?
Was new then, because obviously we were, they were just into the very early stages, I guess, of First World War nostalgia.
Journey's End was 1929, so that's its premiere production.
Oh, interesting, okay.
And it's still on tour today.
And I assume, in fact, let's just see where that was playing at the time, because if I look at the full list of productions...
Savoy.
The Savoy Theatre, there we are. And yes, it opened January 21st, 1929. That was the whole what's on.
And we finished with a final...
No booking fees then.
No. We finished with a final bit of tie-in merchandise. This time, Leslie Henson, the comic, in funny face, advertising Waterman fountain pens.
So here's, gosh, it's very sort of blatant, isn't it? The sort of commercialisation of theatre. I mean, people go on to sort of, they found every possible way of wringing money out of it, but in fact, it seems
all
like
there.
it was very much happening at the time. So there we are. So that was the edition from early 1929, before the world knew what was hitting it. Should we go a little bit further back in time?
Yes, let's have a look.
I've got a play pictorial here, number 279, and this features No No Nanette, and it also includes the cinema pictorial, which had already merged in with the theatre.
No, it was a quarterly supplement, the cinema.
I see, because cinema was so new at this time.
It means it must be after 26, presumably. Because
well, actually, no. We're in the 1st of June 1925 is the date of the
right.
editorial.
So this is pre-talkies then. So all those films would have been silenced.
Ah, okay. I have to enjoy that it says for theatre tickets go to Keith Prowse. I thought he played Darth Vader in the Star Wars.
But actually Keith Prowse's ticket agency is still going, isn't it?
Oh yes,
Prowse, yeah.
Okay. Well, they were 159 New Bond Street, 167 obviously by the end of the 20s. Now this is interesting. The editorial here, B.W. Findon, who we mentioned earlier, writes, "Let me again express my regret to those of my readers who think I deliberately eschew serious plays." Oh, I would never suspect you of that, Mr. B.W. Findon. "It is that class of piece which appeals to me, and I wish devoutly there were more plays worthy the consideration of the play pictorial. And once again, let me emphasise the fact that short-run pieces, however artistic, would soon give us a Rip Van Winkle reputation. One subscriber wanted a number of Mr. Barrymore's Hamlet, but by the time the photos were taken and we got the number out, Mr. Barrymore would have been on his way back to New York." And he certainly would have been endorsing Pond's cold cream for you, I shouldn't think, B.W. Findon.
But that shows you the speed of advertising, and where these days, we can see a show, we can put something on immediately during the interval via Twitter. They're saying that the lead actor will have left by the time they've got photographs and the proof copies of the magazine ready to be published. So it just goes to show it's a much slower turnaround for reporting.
Yes, I had to. Well, of course, these things took a long time to even develop the photos, etc. I like just these little snippets he puts in these editorials. "A few days ago I attended a lecture on Lady Macbeth given by Miss Esme Beringer at the Royal Society of Arts, which she concluded with a dramatic rendering of the sleepwalking scene, a rendering so full of power and magnetic suggestion that one instinctively wondered why an actress of such resource and attainment was so neglected by present-day managers." What if she slipped him a fiver after that came out? Not only that, but over the page we have... sorry, I'm getting a little bit more interested in the historical context here than perhaps the actual shows, but there's a column by the Honourable Mrs. John Fortescue called Modes and Morals, and begins, "The voice is always said to be the index of character, and certain it is that we judge people very much by their voices. An insincere voice prejudices against its owner immediately, just as harsh voice irritates our nerves." Wow, there we go. And after she's pontificated significantly about highly strung temperaments and artistic temperaments and women who have the greatest influence in the world, there's a little note at the bottom that says, "All hosiery in this production supplied by J.H. Edcombe Limited, 36 Soho Square, West 1. Let's have a look at what they were actually not only advertising in this, but pushing in terms of the theatre. And that is No No Nanette, the phenomenal music play success, it says here. Music, of course, by Vincent Humans, the well-known Gifted Humans.
Well, the rhyme there, but
Yes.
do you want to name some of the songs? Because these are known.
Yes, well, they're selling the vocal score complete for 8 shillings, which is actually a bit more, I think, than we were paying even later.
But that's the full score, isn't it?
The full score. Yes, that's right. 2 shillings each, which is the same price. Separate publications may be had as follows. Of Tea for Two, otherwise known as the Tahiti Trot, I believe.
Is it?
I believe so. I Want to Be Happy. No No Nanette. You Can Dance with Any Girl at All. Too Many Rings Around Rosie.
We'll never get Rosie a ring.
I've Confessed to the Breeze. Take a Little One Step. And Where Has My Hubby Gone Blues. Well, if you stop singing the blues, maybe he'll come back. Or you can pay 2 and 6 for a pianoforte selection, or by post 2 and 8, 2 shillings, gosh. And that was Chappell & Co., who we mentioned a little bit earlier. Now, Binny Hale, of course, is from No No Nanette, and once again, there's a little advertising tie-in. There's a picture of her, and she wants you to. Women most admired are those with slim, slender, sylph-like figures, which apparently you can only achieve, along with slim ankles, by the way, which are especially to be desired in these days of dancing and short skirts. You can only obtain them through Clark's thinning bath salts.
Yes. Well, the ankles are achieved through Clark's reducing paste.
Yes.
So acid, as we might call it.
Yes, I don't know how that works, but
we should just say Binny Hale.
You can write for a descriptive booklet post-free in which they request that you please mention the play Pictorial.
But we should say that Binny Hale was the comedienne of the 1920s in Britain, on the British West End, and she was married to Sonny Hale. So Binny and Sonny Hale quite often, not always, quite often did double acts.
Oh, okay.
And they also made a few early British comedy musical films when we were trying to emulate the Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers things, one or two of which are quite good. I was lucky enough to see a rediscovered lost film called Lord Babs, starring Sonny Hale.
Yeah.
And it's, to this day, I love it. It was a marvellous film.
You merely had to turn the page to discover that the actors, who I'm guessing they weren't getting paid very much because they were doing as many cash-in deals as they possibly could with the advertisers, all the stars in No No Nanette preferred to shampoo with Umami. Well, that's good to know, isn't it? I wonder if that even applied to George Grossmith, who didn't have very much hair.
Who's one of the comedy characters in it, and is the son of the famous George Grossmith who did the Gilbert and Sullivans, 30, 40...
Okay.
He's the son.
George
He's the next
Whedon
No, Whedon's the brother.
Ah, okay. Oh, George and Whedon, that's right, yes. So, the play Pictorial. So, there's, once again, a long feature on No No Nanette. And basically, it was one main production each time that got featured, wasn't it, in these, with lots of plates of the rehearsals and of the...
It was a bi-monthly magazine. It came out 6 times a year, the play Pictorial.
Yep.
And so, if you were lucky enough to have your play or musical featured in it, you were doing very well.
And I wonder if a lot of these were... In fact, look, yes, even one of the pictures that they've taken here is they've... advertising Selfridges and Co. is in fact the same one as was advertising the ankle thinning powder.
But it's in colour this time.
But in colour.
Selfridges having the money to throw around.
Yes. Well, of course, there's 2 pages of colour in the whole thing, basically, as well as the outside cover.
The centre spread.
And everything else is black and white in here.
And the centre spread is 3 pictures of Binny Hale.
Even with our living memory, there were often quite a lot of black and white pages in magazines.
Indeed.
And only a few colour ones.
Newspapers didn't go colour in this country till the 1980s.
That's right. Or in fact, yeah. And some of them not even until after that. And Miss Binny Hale, once again,
yes,
very much flavour of the month, continues to advertise. Oh, what is it? Pond's Cold Cream.
It is Pond's Cold Cream.
It seems like every leading lady in London was using Pond's Cold Cream. Why, I should recommend it heartily.
Except for every leading lady from the 1920s is currently dead.
Did you know that it gives you the lovely bloom of perfect health?
Perfect health?
Yes, that's right. And protection against the wind and sun. And not only that, Binny Hale never worried herself about lines and wrinkles. Actually, I hope she did worry about the lines. Okay, and then, yes, and off we go back into the listings of other things that were on. Let's just take a little flip through Columbia Records there again. And Helena Rubinstein advertising. These are all the sort of glamour of bygone era. Let's just see if we can find the listings for everything else that was on in London at that particular time. George Grossmith was actually presenting Tell Me More, which I assume means that he was actually...
Producer.
He was the producer rather than anything to do with it. Oh, here we are. Oh.
No,
we don't even have listings of anything else on the theatre. No, that was so overwhelmingly important. And there's one single column of cinema stories and personalities, or a couple of columns in toto. All right, let's take another look at another one. Do you want to pick one out for me?
Well, this is the oldest one in the collection. This is 1909, I think.
Wow, okay.
And so we're back into the world of operetta and early musical theatre.
We certainly are. And of course, pre the First World War, so really the people going to the theatre at this stage are very much the upper crust, and we didn't have busfuls of soldiers as happened in the First World War going to...
You say that, but it was the Gilberts and Sullivans tell us what we need to know about how theatre was taken at the time. The cheap seats were absolutely full of the workers.
Okay, all right.
So actually theatre was, because there was no cinema in 1909, so to speak, certainly nothing to see.
Right, yeah.
Actually theatre, it wasn't all musical.
No. Lots of variety, that's true. And of course,
Now-
the tail end of the music halls at this stage.
This is a different magazine. This is the theatre magazine.
Yes.
But once again, it follows a very similar model. It's large, in this case, black and white photographic plates
Yep.
by the theatrical producer, plus text about the show.
Some of the changes when you go earlier, I mean, obviously it may be something to do with the specific play that they're featuring here, but the costumes, the idea of the revealing costumes for the women
Gone.
has very much not around in
Yeah.
1909. It was the 20s, the roaring 20s that brought all that on.
Yeah,
Here we have much more demure appearances.
It's full of decorum. She's a florist, isn't she? The heroine in this, Nellie Neal, is the name of the musical.
Right.
And she works in a florist's. She's dressed absolutely as an Edwardian. I mean, she's not got a bustle, but she's got that sort of pinched waist,
Yes.
but no legs at all. Whereas in that last one, No Nanette, we had Binnie Hale
She has-
showing her legs quite specifically in the front
Pretty
cover.
sure she does have some legs under that very long dress.
Well, you can never be certain until you've actually done the
That's
empirical
true.
test.
What I like is the fact that this play features Mr. J.J. Dallas as Mr. Tizzle.
Yes.
There we are, a whole lost world in that.
But I think from memory that this is an odd musical. I think it's about. I think it's got a touch of socialism in it.
Oh, okay.
I think there's the plot is something like she's courted by an aristocrat, but she's not interested because she's she doesn't believe in titles, which in 1909
Yes.
is a
yes.
fairly I mean women's
Well-
rights are also coming in at that time, or there's lots of talk about it. There's a certain amount of socialism is a new political wave. Feminism is a new political wave in its earlier sense, or suffragism at least.
We also have Miss Edna May, well, an actress of the day, and you can see that the production style at this stage, when we look at the In the Cornfield scene, is which is the apotheosis, by the way, of The Simple Life, featuring a little bit more of this Isadora Duncan type of stuff. Everything has got a traditional painted backdrop. That's basically how the theatre was done, and very clear stages, basically with not particularly elaborate sets, which have been a feature of Victorian era, so that there's plenty of clear room for dancing, and very much the way that a lot of Amdram is done
Still
these
works,
days,
yeah.
really. Yes, 100 years later or more.
Would you care to describe the picture of Mr. E. Dagnall as Nordheim?
He looks like a classic cad to me. He's got very sort of highly waxed moustaches, which are pointing almost vertically, just around his nose. He's wearing a top hat and a morning suit of sorts with spats as well, and some gloves. And he and has a very afunctional walking cane, bamboo cane, I would say. It looks like a sort of he looks like an extra from My Fair Lady, I would say, probably more than anything else.
And he's got a quotation.
He does have a quotation.
This is something he said in the musical Nellie Neal.
When I back a horse to win, I believe it's so. But the trouble is that they're all... Oh, sorry, I'm doing the wrong accent here. He's called Nordheim. Does that mean he's either Norwegian
I
or...
think he's supposed to look German to me.
German. Ah, okay. When I back a horse to win, I believe it's so. But the trouble is the horse don't believe it. So the connection is broken, and the bookmaker and I don't speak till the next race. How do you account for this?
And the audience would roll over
They
in
would
laughter.
roar with laughter at whatever the heck he's talking about. The trouble is the horse don't. Oh, I see. So the connection is broken. I see. Right, yes, I see. In other words, he bets and loses. Right.
Yes.
Took me a minute. And look, they even give you the lyrics, as you quite rightly said, in the courtyard of the Savoy. Oh, I believe in the military touch, military touch, military touch. I want your whole attention very much, and I shall get it with the military touch. If I put on pretty epaulets and braid, epaulets and braid, epaulets and braid, if I parade as a soldier maid, with the clanking spur and a flashing blade, I'll catch the eye of a crowd as such, for they can't resist the military touch. She'll catch the eye of the crowd as such, for they don't on the military touch. Yes, I may have got the tune wrong, obviously, but...
But you can see how at this stage operator still is absolutely in the thrall of Gilbert and Sullivan.
Yes, clearly, yes. As in even that bit at the end where they switch to the third person and the entire chorus sings it, for example.
Which, funny enough, G&S had actually dumped in their last couple of musicals.
Had they?
They had actually outgrown it. So it goes to show...
Look, we've got a cartoon here, sorry to interrupt, but by Mr. David Wilson of Mr. George Bernard Shaw, of course, talking of My Fair Lady. And we've got an article here about Herbert Beerbohm Tree.
A famous actor of the
A
time.
very famous actor of the time. It is one of the main evidences of Mr. Tree's arrogant artistry that he is totally unaware of his own limitations. That's rather rude,
backhanded,
isn't it?
yes.
He attacks Shakespeare with the same amazing amount of confidence and élan as he brings to bear on Michael Morton. To every dramatic conception he directs a febrile impetuousness and a whimsical originality which inspire admiration by its mere ingenuousness. One is frequently compelled to say of a tree rendering, it is not acting, but one can always add at the same time, it is magnificent. Interestingly, he is, because they then go on to describe him as the manager of His Majesty's. Of course, what that would have meant he was an actor-manager. In other words, he had the big part in all the plays and also was the sort of executive manager who actually ran the theatre.
And casted all the plays.
Nowadays, of course, half of the theatres in London are all owned by one single management and run by entirely separate people to the leading gentlemen, or ladies for that matter. Talking of which, they also mentioned Sir Charles Wyndham, of course, who
has a theatre.
Very famously has his own theatre. So there we are, and they mentioned, so that's him. I don't know what that is. Miss Constance Collier as Cleopatra rounds off the thing with a little poem about her, alongside Miss Alice Crawford as Charmian. So that is the theatre magazine from 1909, and it's a very... it doesn't tell you a lot about what's really going on, does it?
No.
They hadn't really sort of routinized the idea of listings or those sorts of things. Perhaps those would have been on like hand-printed bills or that sort of thing, maybe in those days.
Very possibly. I mean, you can see the Play Pictorial, which, whilst running at the same time as a theatre magazine, outlived it considerably.
Yes.
Has more text. So they both rely very firmly on pictures.
Yes.
But the play, you can see why the Play Pictorial lasted right up to...
Do you think it's possible that this was aimed more at women, the theatre magazines, or...
Do you know, that's a very interesting
point.
point.
I'm going to sort of offload the sexist assumptions in what I'm about to next say, but I mean, I wonder if the producers of magazines of the time fancied that women tended to prefer less text and more imagery and more pictures because of the sort of fashion connection, and that might have been the reason for marketing this magazine in that particular way. I memean, among the people rich enough to buy this magazine, it might have been... a cliche, but nonetheless perhaps a true one, that that the gentleman might have been buying the Times and the sort of the business type newspapers,
and a copy of the theatre magazine for my wife.
And theatre might have been the pastime of the
ladies,
the leisured women of the time, certainly. So I wonder if that's perhaps what it is. And if you look at the products that are being advertised, that perhaps does tell you that that's exactly who they expected the audience to be. Because
actually, it's all pond cream, isn't it?
Ponds, cold cream, and so on, as well as sort of gramophone records as well.
Things to do during the day whilst your husband's doing business.
Yeah, exactly. So interesting. So and it would be a way for people to keep up with the gossip, if you like, of the theatre and the sort of the surface things. Like there's no article about technical theatre, for example.
No.
It's very much about the stars and the
costumes,
and in particular the female stars of the plays and early musicals of the day. Interesting. Okay, should we look at another?
We'll do one more, shall we?
Yes, let's look at one more.
Do you want another operetta or a Jack Buchanan?
Let's go. What's the latest one we've got here?
I think it's going to be this one.
Okay. Do you want to have a look at that?
Yes.
Words and Music is featured on the front cover of this, and it does look rather different. It's got a picture of from my point of view, a very young-looking Noel Coward, although he must have been... Let's have a look at the date of this one. This one is dated 1932, so we're now into the era of the Depression. You wouldn't know it particularly from this. I mean, the Play magazine Pictorial has not changed. Has the price changed?
How much is it there?
It's 1 shilling net here.
And it was 1 shilling for no Nanette.
So they basically managed to keep it at 1 shilling from all the way from 1925 to 1932, despite the Wall Street crash.
That's not bad.
That isn't bad at all. Good value, this thing. I must write to them at 9 Adam Street. It's still 9 Adam Street at this point, and congratulate them. Still the same advertisements for gramophones, although there's also one here for a radio.
Yes, for new radio services come in.
Which, of course, yes. When was 2LO? About 1929, I think, or something like that?
Yes.
Well, no, 22, sorry, 2LO. And
the BBC...
The BBC was in that early form. I think whether it was by 1932, it would probably become the BBC by that time. But anyway, there's an advertisement here for the McMichael Cabinet Duplex 4 Portable. And that's a lot more expensive than the 1 shilling you pay for this magazine. Everything's reversed, doesn't it?
Yes.
The radio costs 17 guineas, including valves and royalties, which is fascinating. I don't know what the royalties would have been.
Yes. A guinea, by the way, is £1 and a shilling.
£1 and a shilling, which would be £1 and 5p in today's money. Although in today's money, 17 guineas would probably be a few £100, I would guess, if we had an index in... For the inflation since then,
it would have been 252 pennies.
It would have
a guinea.
Right, yeah. Okay, as opposed to 12 pennies, which is what you're paying for this magazine. B.W. Findon once again has
still in the reins,
still holding the reins, giving congratulations to all. The essay showed fair insight into Mr. Coward's work. That's nice to know. They've actually done a Noel Coward essay competition, in fact. The prize essay by Joan Littlefield, interestingly, begins, "It would perhaps have been better for Noel Coward if he had not been a child of the theatre." I'm not sure that any of us can possibly agree with that. "He has lived so long in the world of make-believe, has mastered so easily the arts and crafts that go into the making of a play, has in fact so infallible a sense of what is, quote, good theatre, that it is difficult for him to get away from the merely theatrical." Faint praise, if I ever heard it. They seem to specialise in that.
Yes, they do. Funny enough, you get the sense as you read the play Pictorial over the years that Findon won't give up the reins of power on the editorial and becomes increasingly miserable and cantankerous. Yes, and then suddenly he's not there anymore in some later editions, and you feel he either died or was wrested from...
It's like us on this podcast. You've also got the advert from Morris Angel and Son, this time telling us about the gentleman's modern dresses, worn, it's interesting, very modern indeed, I guess, worn in Words and Music. So Words and Music is the production that gets a lot of fuss made about it here. They've also got Noel Coward, Craftsman or Genius, as a significant thing, but here we are with... what's this? Is this something else?
No, this is the song "Let's Live Dangerously."
Oh yes,
is an Noel Coward number.
So this we think is from Words and Music,
yep.
Which is the big fuss that they're making. Produced by the author at the Adelphi Theatre. Now the Adelphi Theatre is not the... No, it is still the Adelphi Theatre, isn't it? That's right, yeah. That's down there on the Strand. And here we see the theatre, disappearing from some of its more traditional places. We've got a very fanciful rendering of, I guess, Africa, with some African natives in big curly wigs and grass skirts, although not in blackface. No, interestingly for the time.
It's a female chorus who have been given afro wigs essentially, but very and sort of as you say, grass skirts.
Yes,
but
meanwhile you have other people in pith helmets and the trappings of the British Empire. And of course, the song, as you might expect, is "Mad Dogs and Englishmen," delivered
in the photograph by a man in a dog collar.
Oh yes, that's right.
So presumably a missionary.
I assume so, or a mad dog collar. Who knows?
But that's not something that's ever come down in the song. No one ever thinks of it being sung to you by a man of the cloth.
Well, it makes sense in the context because going out in the midday sun is something you very much would avoid in Africa. One imagines. Never been there myself. Right. Anyway. And we also have some modern ideas coming in. There's someone called Steffi Duna playing the Streetwalker, which I think is only possible to read in one possible context, as far as I can see.
Indeed, although Love for Sale, which is by Cole Porter, had been introduced in the 1930s, and that's all about prostitution. The stage was prepared to tackle these things in a very gentle kind of a way.
As you'd very much expect from a Noel Coward production, there's although this is actually from Journey's End. There's a group of young and somewhat dashing young gentlemen in lederhosen.
This isn't the Journey's End we were talking about earlier.
No, it's the scene from the Noel Coward production called Journey's End, based on the
which looks to me like a spoof. Yes, because it's clearly a World War I scene, because the chap in the middle who's sitting at the dining table
is in World War I military uniform.
That's right.
But he's surrounded by these young chaps in lederhosen. It's called The German Prisoner's Dance.
It was a series. Basically,
hilarious.
Words and Music is a revue by Noel Coward. It's not a musical. It's a series of set sketches and songs and jokes, old and new.
Yes,
mostly old.
And here we are. And yes, there's a finale scene, in fact, which is also based on Journey's End, and the song is called Love and War. So there we are. Lots of pictures of actors doing the most peculiar things. We've also got some mantilla'd maids, 5 of them, surrounding the character called Romney Brent, and the song this time runs in an old Spanish garden I found you, the hibiscus was shining all round you. We also have a very young John Mills,
who people won't remember, but in the 1930s was a contemporary of Sonny and Binny Hale, and was also a famous musical theatre comedy star. So it's entirely appropriate that he turn up in an Noel Coward musical.
John Mills, who
this is Sir John Mills, as we know him,
who went on to star in a number of war films, which is really what he's most famous for,
including Noel Coward's war film, in which we serve.
That's right.
He was part of Noel Coward's little repertory company in some senses.
Finished, or he might not quite have finished his career, but who did a lot of BBC dramas at the end, and certainly did some Dickens, and of course was one of the old chaps in When the Wind Blows opposite Peggy Ashcroft. So that's an incredible career from the 30s to the I think the 90s actually for him. Let's see now. and an assortment of other pictures. And Plays of the Month begins, of course, with Words and Music, inevitably, by Noel Coward.
Do you want to read the first couple of lines about it, just to give you a sense of how they describe it?
It says here, Mr. Coward's new review is a composition graced with his own wit and cast by his own choice. Miss Ivy St. Helier is there and Miss Joyce Barber, but there is no domination of any one personality save the author's. Mr. Coward is not collecting stars, he is making them. And the upshot of the first performance was perfectly plain, namely that Mr. Coward can divine stars as other water, or even racehorses. But then the elect are fortunate in this case, for Mr. Coward, having divined his potential bright shiners, is there to assist them to illumination. Very long-winded sort of editorial style. For he is once more the omnicompetent man of the theatre, eliciting from his new recruits the maximum of ability. It was quite good, they seem to be saying.
On the whole, we liked.
Pretty well cast and pretty successful. Meanwhile, at the Wyndham's Theatre, we've got Service by C.L. Anthony. At the Duchess Theatre, we've got Children in Uniform by Krista Winslow. At St Martin's Theatre, we've got Strange Orchestra by Rodney Ackland. I wonder if any relation, possibly.
To who?
Joss Ackland.
Oh, right, yes.
The actor of later years. I'm just keeping an eye on the casts, just to see who there might be that we might recognise. Actually, nobody. Although Jack Hawkins crops up again as Michael Service in Service at the Wyndham's Theatre. And an assortment of other things are on at the same time. Alison's House, Once a Husband, nothing I've really ever heard of, I have to say. The Bear Dances, Wild Violets, and a series of plays were withdrawn, including Tomorrow Will Be Friday, Rhyme and Rhythm, Too True to Be Good, Will You Love Me Always. All of them now lost to history, except in the pages of the play Pictorial. And meanwhile, at the very back, we've got a What's On and What's to See, so the listings are finally now well established, including Casanova, and it mentions Sir Oswald Stoll here, of course, whose surname will be familiar to those who are patrons of Stoll Moss Theatres. And at the Kingsway Theatre, we have not only it's called Versailles, which is a German dramatist version of the Diplomats Assembled at the famous Peace Conference. There's a lot of things which are very much about the last war at that point. Even while this, of course, the next war was very busily brewing at exactly this point, although I suppose people really didn't realise that.
People say 1932 is the last time you could only look back rather than look forward to war.
Well, this is very much what people were doing. Although at the Lyceum Strand, ominously, there was a review titled Here We Are Again, which of course they would be in only 7 years' time after that. So there we are, 1932. I think the play Pictorial and all of these magazines give a sense of a very unchanging theatrical scene, which is to say that, the war clearly had an impact in sort of culture, and people were putting on plays about it, and then even at this stage starting to spoof the plays that had come in the aftermath of the war. But the magazine itself continues issue after issue at 1 shilling each time. And
looking and feeling the same.
Looking and feeling exactly the same, with the same advertisements and the same promotions, and a real sense of continuity until things changed forever.
Musical talk. Well, there we have it. That was Tim Saywood joining me to look at a few random editions of the play Pictorial, which, as I said earlier, was published between 1902 and 1939 before it was absorbed by another magazine. And you heard us mention a couple of times earlier in the programme somebody called B.W. Findon, who was the editor of that magazine right up until the 1930s. Now, Findon was quite an interesting man. His name was Benjamin William Findon, and he was born in 1859 and died in 1943. He was actually a friend of Sir Arthur Sullivan of the Gilbert and Sullivan world, and wrote 2 books about Arthur Sullivan shortly after Sullivan died. One was called Sir Arthur Sullivan, His Life and Music from 1904, and one was called Sir Arthur Sullivan and His Operas in 1908. And he also wrote 3 plays that I've been able to trace. One called The Marchioness, which was described as a comedy operetta from 1904. In 1905 he wrote a show called Melia, Henry and It, which purported to be episodes of a humble life, so very much, I think, in the style of A Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith, who were people, of course, he knew socially. And then in 1927, he wrote a play called Lady Winchling's Dilemma, which was another musical piece, and rather amazingly, was written for radio. It was a radio musical. So he was quite an accomplished man, but being a friend of Sir Arthur Sullivan, you can tell that he's already been left behind as the decades of the 20th century progress forward. He's not a forward-looking man, he is a backward-looking man. And indeed, over the period of his tenureship of the play Pictorial, you can see him becoming increasingly bitter with theatre and musicals, and looking back to what he sees as the Victorian Golden Age, which is rather unfortunate because it meant he wasn't enjoying the new Golden Age of the 20th century. In 1919, he declared publicly that playgoers were becoming bored with shapeless plays and were yearning for a return to well-made drama, as he put it. And then he went further. In 1922, he said, "We have cast aside the old models, our old ideas of what constituted a good play, and appear to have formed a drama more or less based on the lines and conventions of a film production, with its inconsequent procedure and its incidental trivialities." You can see it's very negative, although at one level, in a very reactionary way, quite perceptive, because it's certainly true that the advent of film, which by 1919 was quite sophisticated as an art form, did influence theatre and musical theatre, as we know, throughout the 20th century. You only have to look at Rodgers and Hammerstein's Allegro to see the influence of films later on. But he does seem to be arguing against the concept of abstract theatre, and indeed some of the aspects of what we might now call soap opera. I say these splendid incidental trivialities that he deplored in film and that were creeping into stage production. He's a very odd man, Finden, and if you ever pick up an old edition of the play Pictorial, you can probably date what decade it was written in by reading his editorial. Well, there we are. That's it for this week. It's a slightly curious episode, and I do hope that you've enjoyed it. As I say, for me, reading old editions of the play Pictorial is very much putting oneself in the idea of a musical talk fan 100 years ago, or whenever the edition you're reading was published. And who knows, perhaps in a century from now, some learned gentleman or lady will be looking back at these podcasts and saying, before we beamed theatre into people's heads, people had to listen to oral podcasts. And one such example was musical talk. That was 100 years ago and was presented by a 100-year-old man, one Thos Ribbits. At least that's certainly how I feel sometimes. Anyway, that's enough from me for the time being. So, as always, at the end of an episode, it seems entirely appropriate to say, and I quote, goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, presented by Thos Ribbits and Tim Saywood, and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2015. And don't forget to follow us on the various social networks. And you can follow me on Twitter at Musical Talk Thos. And I can think of no way of saying it. I'll probably leave it there and do an in-studio.
Yeah,
That's by far the best way.